Hello and welcome to Broad History. I'm your host, Isabel Hugal. Have you ever spent hours slaving over a holiday meal, or for that matter, over the relentless repetition of everyday meals, cleaned up after a sick child, or devoted an entire Saturday to catching up on the chores that piled up during the week? Have you ever done that and thought, exhausted and bored, man, I should get paid for this? Well, some women tried. Today, we are continuing our exploration of women and work with an episode on a movement that I have to admit I'd never heard about until now, the Wages for Housework campaign. It's exactly what it sounds like, a campaign to compensate women monetarily for the work that they do for their families. And if you're thinking that that sounds radical and utopian, well, yes, but that's what the 70s were like. So for some of you, this will be lived memory, but I grew up in the girl power era and I matured in the girl boss era. And this is neither of those things. It's a very different kind of feminism that I got curious about. So my guest today is Dr. Emily Callaci, a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, who has just published Wages for Housework and has had access to incredible archives as well as the surviving organizers of this movement. And she's going to take us back to this unique moment in feminism. Emily, hello and thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So I think we need to sort of introduce first the central idea. What is wages for housework?
Thanks. So as you point out, it is exactly what it sounds like. And I think, perhaps the best way to introduce the idea is to think about the moment in which it arose. So you mentioned second wave feminism. It's a time when women all over the world were coming together to really question, women's role in society and to really fight for, more power, more resources, for liberation. And, so that included demands like right to abortion, like equal pay for equal work, equal opportunities for education, all these really, really crucial things. But one of the insights that some women had at that time from this movement was that, while all those gains and all those struggles are critical for women's power and for liberation, they don't address one of the core issues that women face, which is that they are doing, so much unpaid work to make society function. Think about all the work of caring for children, all the work of, caring for the elderly, caring for the sick, preparing the workforce to go to work every day through housework. Their insight was that, a lot of that, did not address the core issue, which is that women were working this double shift, and so to really address the women's empowerment, you can't just think about legal rights in the legal sphere. You have to think about all these economic factors that have women doing all of this work and yet not sharing in the wealth that it produces.
And I think one idea that when I was reading you that I thought was unique or different from the way that I had heard people talk about housework before is that it's not just something that they're doing for their families. They are helping capitalism run by cleaning and cooking.
Exactly. This is, I think, the critical insight here. So, just to start with a kind of, one of my favorite quotations from Selma James, one of the founders of this movement. She had this insight. She said, "You can't make Ford cars and change nappies at the same time," right? This insight that, when a boss hires somebody to work, they're basically getting, two workers for the price of one. They get the person who shows up to work every day to work on the assembly line or, mine the coal out of the ground or, work in an office. But they also get the labor of the person who cares for them, the person who cooks their meals and cleans their house and prepares them to go to work each day. What Maria Rosa Della Costa, one of the other founders of this moment, said was that, the critical thing that women produce for the economy, which is not recognized, is they create labor power itself.
Right. So the boss pays for one worker, but really they're getting a whole support team that is unacknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
One thing that I think is quite confronting in the analysis of this movement compared to, for middle class women, for professional women, that and for the kind of feminism that maybe we're more used to, is that it's almost saying like we're not interested in a better situation in the workplace. We're not interested in, hiring discrimination or equal pay. I mean, I think it is it Federici who says all work is shit. Like there is no
Yes.
work that we want to be a part of. We don't want any of this. Which there is no fulfillment in work, which is something that
Yes.
might be very foreign to people who think of themselves as career women.
Yeah, I think, I also grew up in the kind of girl power 90s with the idea that, women's liberation comes through our careers, which is, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. And I think that's very important. I mean, of course, I'm in favor of equal pay for equal work. Of course, I'm in favor of education and all these things. Um, but one of the insights of Wages for Housework was that idea about the value of work, the satisfaction of work, is a very middle class perspective. For someone, for example, who's going to clean toilets for a living, or someone who's going to work in a coal mine and breathe in, the coal dust, like these kinds of jobs, are not liberating for anybody, And again, one of the sort of insights in this is from Wilmette Brown, who was one of the founders of Black Women for Wages for Housework, is that the idea that going to take on another shift working at McDonald's is going to liberate you, is really is kind of insulting to people who do that work. So I think that's one of the things I think was very shocking about Wages for Housework, was that there's a very anti-works politics within that at a time when so much of the feminist movement was about liberation in the workplace, having the ability to raise to the same ranks within a company that men raise to, and so I think that kind of questioning of the value of work and trying to recast that as something that was really in favor of the boss's perspective, which is that you should seek to work as a form of liberation. That was something they really tried to question.
Mm. I think it's something that probably will start to resonate more. I don't know. This might be very much the bias just of what I'm seeing around me, but I'm certainly seeing a lot of middle class to millennial and Gen Z women having lost a lot of illusions about fulfillment through career these days. I don't know.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's true. And because I teach, I teach students of that, of a younger age, and I think that a lot of feminists in the 70s, as I said, found Wages for Housework very controversial because it was basically seeking to, rather than leaving behind housework, it was about recognizing housework, right? And at a time when you're trying to sort of sever that link between yourself and housework and challenge the idea that women are naturally suited to it, it seemed counterintuitive to demand compensation for it, right? A lot of people thought, won't that just entrench us in this role,
exactly.
make us. So that was one of the things I think that was really challenging and counterintuitive about it. But as you say, when I talk to younger people about it, people who have become, somewhat disillusioned with the idea that liberation will come through work, who are people who are facing the possibility that their standard of living will be lower than their parents' generation, people who are finding themselves unable to afford housing, like the idea that a job in the market economy is going to be their source of liberation. I think Wages for Housework and their critique of work is something that really resonates much more with younger people than I would have expected.
Hmm. And obviously, work that, is shift work, work that is, backbreaking, exhausting, maybe not glamorous, maybe not intellectually fulfilling. That is the reality of the global majority of men and women, right? I mean,
Yes.
it is a luxury to feel stimulated by work. But obviously, as you say, one critique which they received a lot is this idea that, well, we're just entrenching women in the home as domestic workers, and we're almost, if we're paying them for it, are we saying like there is no escape from it? How did the campaign kind of respond to that?
Hmm. Sure. Yes. And I should say that's, it's a critique that I completely understand, right? Again, you can imagine the 1970s, women who grew up fighting the expectation that your destiny in life is to do housework. The idea suddenly someone comes to you and said, no, you should get paid for housework. That is something that I think really cut against the grain of what feminism was about. But I think it's really important to recognize that Wages for Housework was not promoting the nuclear family ideal, was not promoting women as housewives. And they were very clear that their campaign was not wages for housewives. It was wages for housework.
Mm.
It was about recognizing that work as part of the economy, whether a man did it or a woman do it, and so the idea, the kind of utopian idea here was that what we have to do is recognize that work as part of the economy, recognize that historically it has been gendered. And once you recognize that and you demand compensation for it, you challenge the way that capitalist society exploits that labor and makes profit from it, then you can start to challenge the capitalist system as a whole. Then you can start to challenge a scenario where so many people in the world, the majority of whom are women, are doing work for free to make the system function, empowering and making profits for other people, right? To challenge that system is what you're doing when you're demanding wages for housework. So by proclaiming, or demanding that wage, you're not saying, I'm going to be a housewife. That's my role in life. I'm going to participate in that kind of patriarchal construct. What you're doing is demanding that the system actually recognize something materially that's already, part of how the economy functions.
Right. And we should say, I mean, that's kind of the subtext through everything we've talked about so far. Obviously, it is a Marxist analysis. It is a sort of radical left campaign, which, is going to make some people's hair stand on end. But
Yeah.
it's very much part of the analysis, right? So it's something that you can't really understand without that sort of Marxist frame of analysis, I think, on the
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one insight that they have that I thought was interesting as well is that if you recognize this housework, it also kind of helps value it sort of to its real value. So there's this insight in your introduction that I thought was interesting is that the closest that work is to the work that women do for free in the house, the less valued it is
Mm-hmm.
monetarily by the economy, right? So that's why we don't really pay nurses and teachers and cleaners and sanitation workers very well, is because they're a lot like your mom and you're expecting
Mm-hmm.
your mom to work for free.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was this great quotation, from the 1970s. One of the anecdotes in my book is about the sanitation workers strike, and there's this artist who was interviewing sanitation workers. And one of the comments that one of the sanitation workers made was, they don't respect us because they think we're their mother, So it's just
Mm.
that implicit assumption that that work is denigrated, right? Calling something the work that your mother does is an excuse to think of it as valueless, I think that says so much about the role of this work in society.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if it might help for me to talk about, just to give a bit of context for the 5 women that are the center of the book.
Yes, that was my next question because
Okay,
we've
go
thrown a
ahead.
few names.
Sure,
But let's talk about who they are.
sure. And so one of the things I found so fascinating about this movement was how widespread it was. It's a movement that, was fairly small, but they had branches in the UK, in New York, in Italy, in the Caribbean. And so I focused my book on 5 women in particular who I thought, who, first of all, had really critical roles in defining this politics. But part of what I was interested in is how they really understood housework in different ways. So the first person I focus on is Selma James. So she was born in 1930 in Brooklyn, New York, and grew up in a very kind of radical immigrant community in Brooklyn. She grew up, around members of the American Communist Party and the Trotskyist Socialist Workers Party. And so she grew up around radical politics. And as a young woman, one of her insights was that much of the left at that time really understood working class politics through the lens of the male worker who went to work in a factory, the kind of classic proletariat. And the idea that to become a radical member of a social movement, you had to go and work in a factory, right? But she grew up in a context where women were doing really critical activism. Her mother was involved in organizing tenants, organizing mothers to collect their payments from the government for childcare. So she really understood housewives as being inherently political, even as the left kind of cast them as people who were apolitical. So she, in the 1950s, she moved to Los Angeles, joined this kind of offshoot of the Socialist Workers Party called the Johnson Forest Tendency. And they're basically trying to organize workers, in a kind of broader working class struggle. And her role within that was to go around to all the housewives in the neighborhood and ask them about their daily labors and their daily lives. And so she really became convinced that, these women are not counted as workers, but they have all this political potential. If we could just kind of bring that into how we think about the labor movement, we could really have a truly authentic labor movement that included everybody. And so in the 1970s, when second wave feminism really kind of hit the scene, she'd already been thinking about this issue of unpaid work in the home for several decades already. So she really brought that struggle to second wave feminism. And for her, second wave feminism was really an extension of class struggle. She understood the women's movement as a movement of the working class more generally, and that women were an unacknowledged part of the working class.
And it's so
So
much,
she's,
sorry,
yeah,
it's so much harder to organize, right? Women who are not together essentially in a factory, right? If everyone is just spread
exactly.
out and sort of within the four walls of their house most of the
Hmm.
day, you don't have that
Exactly. Yes.
exchange, right?
Yeah, exactly. That isolation in the home is really part of the struggle. It's how do you actually build a kind of collective movement when you don't have the factory floor as the kind of location where everybody gathers. So that was her real challenge, and that was her real ambition, was to, make a working class movement that could bring in all those unpaid workers as part of how we think about the working class.
Mm.
And so that's Selma James. The second person I write about is Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, who grew up in northeastern Italy, in a place called Treviso, and she was part of student movements in the 1960s at the University of Padua, and she was part of a movement known as operaismo, which was a kind of coming together of the student movement and the workers' movement to really challenge some of the expansion of factory capitalism across northern Italy in the post-war era. And there were all these, wildcat strikes, all these attempts to really question the profit and efficiency model that was being kind of, basically taking over factory life, but also everyday life, in cities in the north of Italy. So she joined this movement. She organized outside of factory gates, with the operaisti. But again, like Selma James, she had this insight that this notion of working class struggle doesn't account for all the work that we as women are going to be expected to do as we get older, raising children, taking care of our parents, taking care of basically people, and particularly in a very Catholic society, there's this real gendered expectation that women produce children for the state and for God. And
Mm.
so for her, she had this, quotation that, or she had this idea that if you're thinking about workers working on a factory line, an assembly line, you have to imagine the assembly line extends far beyond the factory into the home, where people are there, getting the worker ready to go to work every day, producing, the worker by feeding him, doing his laundry, cleaning the house, producing children for the next generation of workers. So for her, that's where the working class struggle began, in the home, where workers are being produced and raised. So those are the first two members. They, Selma James and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, they met in the early 1970s and, basically realized that they had a lot of politics in common. So they launched the Wages for Housework movement together. Selma James in London, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa in Italy. And then the third person I write about my book is Silvia Federici. So she's probably the most well-known, at least in the U.S., of the
Hmm.
campaign. She's been a very her work is very widely read, and she's still a very
Yes.
active, feminist activist.
So if you're in women's history, you've come across her.
Absolutely, yes. So she was also born in Italy, in Parma, in the kind of the red belts of Italy, where the Italian Communist Party was kind of a stronghold there. And she grew up very active in politics. But even though she grew up in a very kind of politically progressive community, she still faced these very kind of strict gendered expectations, about the role that women would play, in society, again, as homemakers, which is a role that she really resisted very strongly. And so she, as a young woman, she went to the US to get her PhD in philosophy. And, she had this real interest in class politics and, the student movements of the 60s, and also in feminism. But it's really when she kind of, encountered the work of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, really talking about women's unpaid work in the economy, that she really thought that, feminism had a place for her. So she, went home for the summer, met Maria Rosa della Costa. And then when she came back to New York, where she was living, she started the New York Wages for Housework Committee in the mid 1970s. And that was a really critical moment because this is, just to give you a bit of historical context, New York at that time was on the brink of bankruptcy. There was a big financial crisis. And there was, the way that the city responded to that was through austerity measures, cutting social programs. And, at that time, the Wages for Housework campaign in New York really thought about that as a feminist issue, because so many of the things that were on the chopping block were things like childcare, were things like welfare payments, were things like subsidies for women to, go to college for free, right? So, they tried to really reframe the issue of austerity and say, austerity is not just tightening your belt and, making government more efficient. It's freeloading on women's unpaid work. It's taking things that are collectively recognized as valuable and paying for it, and then just stopping paying for it, expecting that women will continue to do it for free.
Right, because you're not going to stop feeding children or educating children, right? So you're just
Exactly.
expecting women to pick up the slack because somebody's
Yes,
got to, right?
exactly. Yeah. And so the fourth person I wrote about in my book, and this is the person who really, whose work I really was inspired by and made me want to write the book, is Wilmette Brown. So Wilmette Brown, she was born in Newark, New Jersey, which is a very segregated city in the United States. She grew up immersed in the civil rights movement. She was a brilliant student and went to Berkeley, where she was, involved in student activism there and the anti-war movement. And during her studies there, she encountered the Black Panther Party, which was based in the San Francisco Bay Area at that time. And so she left university and began becoming basically a full-time organizer with the Black Panther Party. She participated in the first struggle for ethnic studies at San Francisco State University. But at times she found that her identity as a Black lesbian woman was not an identity that was fully recognized within the Black Panther Party that she was a part of, because there was a kind of masculinist politics and a kind of, idea of the gender roles within that, within the groups that she was a part of there. So she left the Panther Party. She went to Southern Africa and taught English for a couple of years. And then when she came back to New York in the 1970s, this again was right at the moment when second wave feminism was hitting. And she encountered the writings of Selma James and Maria Rosa della Costa about wages for housework. And for her, that was a real kind of aha moment, because for her, this question about women's unpaid labor was an extension of the Black freedom struggle. She was thinking about this in terms of longer histories of slavery and colonialism and the ways that the United States and the global North have extracted the labor of Black women through histories of enslavement and colonization. And so for her, wages for housework was really a version of the movement for reparations, really trying to recognize all the work that has been exploited historically along racial lines. And so she, together with the fifth person I write about in my book, Margaret Prescott, founded Black Women for Wages for Housework, which was a branch of Wages for Housework that understood the issue of unpaid labor of women, particularly through the lens of race and racialized dispossession. So Margaret Prescott, the fifth person in my book, she was born in Barbados when it was still under colonial rule. And one of the factors that she grew up with that really had a big impact on her was the extent to which women in her community traveled abroad to work as low-paid domestic workers in the global North, in New York and London. Despite having been the site where many of the profits of the British Empire came from, many of the profits of the slave trade came from, she grew up in relative poverty. So many people had to go and work abroad to send home remittances as a way to kind of, lift the family above poverty wages. So she sees so many of the women in her family going to work abroad and not making enough money to even bring their families with them. And this is a really painful part of her childhood. And then she moved to Brooklyn, New York in the 1960s into a very kind of activist, family and community that was involved in the civil rights movement. And she encounters this very different discourse in America, which is this idea that, immigrants are freeloaders. They're here taking advantage of the riches of Western society. They're collecting benefits from the government. Immigrants are the problem. And from her perspective, it was exactly the opposite, right? Immigrants were coming to the US, having their labor exploited, and they were creating much of the wealth of society and not being compensated properly for it. So for her, she really brought to Wages for Housework a real understanding that the exploitation of unpaid work and the work of women crosses national borders too. That much of that exploitation, and profit making is not just about within a society or within a country, rather, exploiting the unpaid work of women, but across on a global scale, women in the global South producing wealth for the global North through that unpaid work.
There's I think a really powerful connection that's made in your book that is still extremely current, which is this idea of this connection. You have women, from what we'd call today the global South, having to leave their children behind in the care of women who are paid even less than they are, so they can make a little bit more money in the West, working, potentially for Western women who are employing them to free their time to themselves be able to make just a little bit more money
Yes.
in paid work. So you have these like connections of women just making barely more than the woman who allows them to even be able to work outside the home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm interested in the work that these last two women that you mentioned do to connect welfare as well to the idea of wages for housework. This idea that actually welfare payments they're not charity, they're not welfare, they're due. Can you tell
Absolutely.
me more
Thank
about
you.
that?
Yes, yes. And perhaps for, a UK audience, the campaign that really uh, was concurrent with the Wages for Housework was the Family Allowance campaign, the campaign to protect family allowance at a time when there was a political push to get rid of the payments that were going directly to women and instead pay it through their husband, through his employer, right? And the argument that Wages for Housework made was, this money is the only source of income that many women have. It's a source of autonomy. And so to take that away and pay it through their husband, really is a blow against, women's power and women's autonomy. So in the U.S., Wages for Housework, and particularly Black women for Wages for Housework, understood Wages for Housework as an extension of the welfare rights movement, which was a really important political movement in the U.S., led mostly by poor working class and Black women. And basically, their argument was to understand welfare payments as compensation for the socially necessary and important work of raising children. The language that cast it as a kind of a handout or as a charity payment really kind of missed the point, that this was payment for really vitally important social work. And so one of the arguments, or one of the efforts that Black Women for Wages for Housework made, was to get together with women from the welfare rights movement and to protest cuts to the welfare system that were happening in the 1970s by reframing recipients of welfare as workers that were, not again demanding a handout, but demanding fair pay for the work that they were doing. And so this, the place where this kind of becomes solidified in the historical record is there's this really important conference in 1977, kind of convened at the initiative of Jimmy Carter's administration, the national, or during the Carter administration, the National Women's Conference in Houston in 1977. And Wages for Housework got together with women from the National Welfare Rights Association. Some of the figures here historically are Johnny Tillman and Beulah Sanders. And basically they got a kind of statement to be ratified by the convention that said that, not only should welfare be protected, should the amounts be increased, but it should have the dignity of being called a wage rather than a handout, to recognize that these women are doing skilled, important work. So I find that really important, to recognize this as work is to recast this as, a demand for charity or sympathy, and basically recognize it as a demand for justice, for workers' justice. And so, Margaret Prescott and Wilmette Brown were doing this organizing, particularly in Queens College, where they were both on the teaching faculty at that time. And this is a time when, I mentioned the austerity crisis in New York in the 1970s. There are cuts being made to welfare programs, cuts being made to subsidized childcare, and cuts being made to college tuition. This is a time when university was free in New York. It's no longer free. But part of the argument they were making was that many of the students, in the university system in New York, were also care workers. A lot of them were single mothers. A lot of them were caring for their siblings or for their extended family. And so, they were trying, there was this real kind of discourse in New York at that time was that students are freeloaders. They're getting all these benefits from the government. It's wasting everybody's money. And they tried to really demonstrate that these students were workers in many senses of the word. So one of their strategies was to hold these kinds of speakouts where students would go and they would speak about the different kinds of work that they did on the course of a typical school day. They would, perhaps, for example, wake up, take a relative to a medical appointment, prepare the children for school, take the children to school, go to their classes at university, come home, get the children home, go to the shift for their paid work job because they have to have another kind of income, and then get home, say late at night and have to do their homework, and then get up the next day and do it all again, right? As a way of challenging this idea that, recipients of welfare were freeloaders, and try to turn that around and show how they were actually some of the hardest workers in society. Without their work, everything would grind to a halt. So that connection between welfare and wages for housework was the way they tried to bring together this very working class, poor, Black women's movement and, try to project it into this bigger kind of analysis of capitalism.
Mm. So how far did the movement go? I mean, did we ever get to a point that there was a bill out there to introduce wages for housework, or did it stay sort of this, intellectual and activist campaign, without a physical reality? I mean, did they even imagine how that would work in practice? Because I know that's a criticism that they got.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of disagreement within the movement about this. So I think that, for example, for Silvia Federici and Maria Rosa Della Costa, there was this sense of political theater about it, that by demanding wages for housework, you're kind of demonstrating, capitalism's internal contradictions, right? And you could, therefore kind of the next steps, were less a policy blueprint than kind of trying to launch a movement that would, challenge the system. I think that particularly for Prescott and Brown and Selma James, and again, through their kind of linkages with the welfare rights movement, there was a real kind of concrete sense of having, demands for government compensation for welfare as a kind of first step that can then lead to further demands, So there was a sense that, fighting with the welfare rights movement, fighting for things like the family allowance, were part of the bigger kind of aim of, of challenging this situation where women's work is unpaid and essential to the economy. But I have to say, like, if you're asking me, did they succeed in getting wages for housework? The answer is mostly no. This is this is started in the 1970s, and next you have the 1980s, which is the era of Reagan and Thatcher and massive cuts to many things that we might think of as wages for housework. Things like subsidized childcare, things like welfare, so in that concrete sense, this is really kind of an unfulfilled promise. I should mention that many members of this campaign are still doing this work. They're still together, particularly Selma James. I think she is 95 now, and she runs the Crossroads Women's Center in London. But they're still very much, again, campaigning around wages for housework, although the demand has been, kind of updated to a more kind of modern sensibility. Now it's called care income now, the idea of asking for compensation for that work, calling it a care income rather than housework or wage for housework. And they've really extended the analysis in many different directions. And I think it got a lot of traction, for example, during the COVID pandemic, because the issue of unpaid work was just so apparent to us in a way that perhaps it had been hidden before. And so, it was amazing to me, within like a week or two of the pandemic hitting, they were having teach-ins, they were having these discussions together with people who worked in the health sector, people who worked in, anti-poverty campaigning, really talking about the need for a care income as a way to recognize this work and the kind of massive crisis we are now collectively facing about, the lack of care work and the lack of resources for care work. Another direction that they have gone in recent years, or not that recent, I guess for several decades now, and this is really kind of spearheaded by Wilmette Brown, is to think about the work of, surviving climate change and some of the environmental catastrophes that we're facing. And one of the issues that got this way of thinking started was the crisis over nuclear power and the Chernobyl disaster, and thinking about the kinds of unpaid care work that go into caring for people who are living with the consequences of environmental degradation and pollution. And of course, we know that those effects are experienced differently by people depending on their socioeconomic status, depending on factors like race. And so, Lynette Brown really talked about what she called the housework of cancer. She talked about, so she grew up in Newark, New Jersey, where they have the highest cancer rates in the country at that time. And part of that had to do with the industrial production of chemical weapons along the river near Newark, New Jersey, that then polluted the local environment and then led to higher cancer rates. And so the community was facing having to care for all these people who were getting sick from these industrial processes. And so an extension of that has been to think again about environmental issues as housework issues, as women's labor issues. And one of the places where I thought about this most recently is, and I'm not sure how familiar UK listeners will be with this, but we had this crisis in the US in a place called Flint, Michigan, where there was basically the story where there were these elevated rates of lead poisoning within the water system there. And again, this is a community that's predominantly Black, predominantly working class. And I think that wages for housework really helps us understand that as an environmental issue, but also an issue of women's unpaid work, because so much of what it requires to care for people who are ill in that kind of community, to try to prevent people from getting ill in that context, to try to raise children when you can't even trust the water supply, right? This is all work that women are having to do for free to live in a society that, has all these environmentally harmful practices. So the wages for housework as a concrete demand for payment, from the government in the 70s, that demand was not met. That was not a successful movement in that respect. In other respects, I think there's a really long afterlife of this movement that really helps us reframe some of the most pressing issues that we face today, from the care crisis to the environmental crisis.
Yeah, there's something that's extremely current. I mean, it raises for me a lot of things that, before I studied history and journalism, I studied economics first, and a lot of things that I think we're still talking about today when we talk about the economy. Things like the way that the profits of enterprise are privatized, but the negative externalities like pollution, like consequences for society, harm on people, that is collectivized. And when we say it's collectivized, it's really a lot of unpaid women's work to sort of pick up the tab for a lot of those effects. So I think that's very current, as well as something I know I was certainly taught in economics classes, the idea that things like the numbers that we're staring at all day, like GDP, don't account for so much work that exists in the world that
absolutely
housework, right? Which is something, I don't know, that my economic studies, that was 30 years ago. I don't think we've solved that one yet. But something else that you touched on that we didn't talk about that I thought was really interesting, it's that switch from housework to care work, which almost I think makes it maybe a little bit more palatable. It's more noble, right? Care work. And this idea that this is a work of love, right? There's this beautiful quote: "What you call it love, we call it unwaged labor." And it's unwaged labor or unpaid labor, something like that.
Yes, that's a quotation from Silvia Federici.
Yes. I wonder if you could talk about that. The way that all that work is wrapped up in this idea of love or familial obligation, and how we and how these campaigners sort of think about that, and the idea that you would be almost introducing capitalism or capitalistic or moneyed relations within something that is being presented as, sort of this sacred work of love and of family.
Yeah, I love that quotation too. I think it's one of my favorite. It might be my favorite one, because it's comes from Silvia Federici's questioning, why is it that women have done this for free historically? How are we socially pressured to do it? And it's through that idea of love, that this is fulfilling to you. This is something you should do because it is generous, because you are a good mother, because that's what it means to be feminine, right? And so part of what Wages for Housework was trying to do was to take off that veneer of holiness and virtue, and reveal it for its real hard-nosed economic function. They saw that ideology of love as a way of basically, pressuring women to do it for free, right? So that's part of what they were trying to address. And I think, one of the things that I think is the real tension within both Wages for Housework, but also in how I think about it, is that, you could say on the one hand, is the point of thinking about housework to recognize that it is virtuous, that it is highly skilled, that it is, fulfilling, and that becomes a reason to value it. Or does that then further kind of, play into that idea that housework is virtuous and it is feminine and you should do it for free? Is the other perspective that housework should be compensated because it sucks, and because it's hard and it's time consuming and it's boring, and it's not fair that women have to do it and men don't. So I think those two perspectives are kind of at war within me when I think about it. And they're kind of, I think, contradictory or rather, in tension within the movement itself. And I think that's why I think, on the one hand, calling it care work, there's been a real turn, I think, towards thinking about the value of care. And I think this also is something that has been really taken up in conversations about mutual aid that I think have become much more central from our experiences living through the pandemic. And I think that my own ambivalence about that is that, again, on the one hand, I think it's really important to uplift that work and to not see it as less skilled. It's incredibly skilled, much of it, But one of, I think, the problems with that is that there still is always going to be a lot of housework that kind of sucks, so for example, there's this magnificent article by the sociologist Dorothy Roberts. I think sociology is her discipline, I'm not sure. But basically, it's this article from the 90s, that, I forget what it's called now. But it talks about this sort of way in which the housework done by white middle class women, can be cast as virtuous and rewarding, taking care of children, reading them bedtime stories, taking this great care with this kind of work. But that's never going to be the way we talk about cleaning toilets, right? Or cleaning up vomit on a hospital floor, right? And so by elevating it all as care work, are you then separating out the kinds of work that are done by more middle class women and then, separating it out from the kinds of work that tend to be done by low paid women of color or, poorer women? Like, by separating those things from each other, are you, perpetuating this kind of inequality, right? Part of what I think housework does and Wages for Housework does is by taking away that veneer of emotion and virtue, you see it as an economic issue rather than as an emotional issue. And you can do away with some of that ideology.
Mm. Yeah, I find that really interesting, and the way that I think we see it in the world of sort of more work in the more traditional sense in paid work, in the careers that you choose, right? If your career is a calling, somehow that's becomes a reason to pay you a lot less, right? We see it in academia,
Oh,
we see it
yes.
in journalism, we see it in
Yes.
the arts, right?
Yeah.
You shouldn't make money if you're an artist, but if you work in finance, that's okay. So
Yeah.
those I think are similar dynamics at play that are really interesting.
Yeah.
So when we get towards sort of, you say this campaign continues in some ways, but really it ended right with, as you say, with the end of the 70s and the change of the sort of political moment. I think what's really incredibly poignant and sad and beautiful all at once is that a lot of these women sort of drop out of the fight because of the very reasons that brought them to the fight, right? It's they have to
Mm-hmm.
care for aging parents, they have less time for
Mm-hmm.
activism, they have less time for politics, they need to take full-time jobs to support themselves, because all that activism, all that intellectual work isn't necessarily remunerated. Yeah, I think that's very, very poignant, very telling.
Yeah, it is. And I should say that, the Italian Wages for Housework campaign, really ended in the late 1970s, in part for the reasons you mentioned, women becoming older and having to do that kind of care work. Also because in the late 1970s, there's a wave of political repression of the left in Italy that really forced activists underground. And the New York Wages for Housework Committee closed down basically in the 1970s. But a lot of them really did keep campaigning throughout the 1980s. I think that because those were such a terrible decade for feminism in many ways, that we don't know their work as well.
Mm.
But many of the campaigners, particularly in London, and Margaret Prescott moved to Los Angeles, where she was campaigning there, particularly around defending welfare rights. And particularly against protesting austerity measures. That work was really, I think, very important. Again, it's not as well known as the work in the 70s. And I think because they kept doing that work throughout the 1980s and 90s, I think that's part of why this work has been able to endure, because then when, say, the COVID-19 pandemic hits, there are people who've been thinking about this all along for a very long time who can share their insights with us and organize, So, yeah, it's got me thinking a lot about the kinds of feminist activism that are happening at times that are very hostile to feminism and that, might not be as well known, So yeah, I think that to just be clear, I do think a lot of the activism continued past the 1970s, even though the end of the 70s was a major moment of defeat for them.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. And so I wonder, so it's sort of my last question. So you mentioned, the sort of a lot of long tail legacy. And so what are you talked about, care work and the pandemic. What are sort of other areas where you see sort of a continuation or a legacy of wages for housework? I mean, one thing that came to mind when I was reading you was the idea of universal basic income, which
Mm-hmm.
sounds not the same, but
Yeah.
sort of a child of that idea, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think in many ways the care income campaign has some similarities with basic income. And, I know there are different kinds of schools of thought within basic income. And there are many trials going on right now, actually, that are specifically targeted towards, for example, women in their first year of motherhood, right? Trying to give an income to those women, with the understanding that it's better for women, it's better for children, it's the kind of program that targets them. So that's a real kind of connection between basic income and wages for housework. Another way in which I think it's connected is, as you've kind of talked about earlier, is thinking about delinking income and the right to live and thrive in the world from paid employment. Thinking about income as something that is a right and something that is beneficial, that's not just dependent on you working for an employer. So I think that's again another sort of legacy, and there are real kind of connections between that movement and the Wages for Housework movement. And I was at a conference that was held by the Global Women's Strike recently that had several people from the Basic Income Campaign, talking about the connections between Wages for Housework and basic income programs. So that's definitely one of them. Another place where I see a longer term legacy of Wages for Housework is in conversations about a Green New Deal, particularly in the US and also in the European Union. And part of the thinking there is how to prioritize an economy emphasizing work that is not disastrous for the environment, moving away from a model of economic productivity that's based on extracting things from the environment, putting carbon into the ozone, right, and doing these things that are terrible for the environment, rather shifting towards forms of work that are either neutral or positive for the environment. And care work is one of those functions, right? Care work will always be necessary to our economy. It's not something that can be outsourced to, AI or something. But it is something that can work to renew and protect and conserve the environment rather than extract from it and pollute it. So many people who are thinking about a Green New Deal are thinking about how can we make care work the center of a green economy. So that's another connection between Wages for Housework and contemporary movements. And then a third place where I really see many of these insights being taken up is for the efforts of domestic workers around the world, domestic workers organizing. So there's this movement of domestic workers in the U.S. I'm not sure about labor laws in the UK actually, but in the US, domestic workers, housekeepers and house cleaners, many home health aides are not protected by labor laws because the home is not considered a workplace. And there are lots of historical, reasons for this. But like basically, if you go to work in a factory, your employer has to provide certain protections under labor law in terms of,
Hmm.
for example, if you're breathing in chemicals, they have to supply like, the proper kind of masking or the proper ventilation. You have to be given things to keep the work environment safe. Those protections don't apply for most, people who work in the home. So much of the organizing for domestic workers has been around recognizing the home as a workplace and trying to seek labor protections for domestic workers. And one of the victories of this movement was in passing the ILO International Labor Organization Convention 189, which is popularly known as Decent Work for Domestics, that really tried to recognize, again, the home as a workplace. And what I found that really interested me was that one of the big organizers to pass this convention was Ida LeBlanc, whose mother founded the first Wages for Housework branch in Trinidad and Tobago. Her mother is Clotel Walcott.
Mm.
So a direct connection between the efforts of Wages for Housework in the 70s and 80s and this current organizing that's happening for decent work for domestics.
Wow, a little direct, sort of familial
Yes.
connection. Emily Callaci, thank you so much. I think this is really interesting. I think it's a campaign that, in some ways is really confronting and is, challenging intellectually in some ideas that, I mean, not necessarily agree with, but I think are just very interesting to think about, to sort of reimagine the world and the economy differently, which, if the future that we're promised in terms of AI, eating half our jobs is work that we're going to have to do, right? Figure out how we divorce income from jobs that no longer exist, apparently. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for that enlightening conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your really thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed it.
That was Emily Callaci. Her book is Wages for Housework. You can find it in the bookstore, the Broad History bookstore in the US and the UK. Every sale supports this show and helps make it happen. You can also sign up as a member and you will get access to the podcast early, as well as help make this happen with a small monthly or annual donation. You can also simply make a one-time donation, and I would really appreciate your support so that I can continue. Thank you very much. This was Broad History. I'm Isabel Hogal, and I will talk to you very soon.